Cold never announced itself loudly in old houses. It didn't rush in like a storm. It crept. It slid along floorboards, slipped under doors, followed walls, and settled where it wasn't wanted. Grandparents understood this, and they followed a quiet rule that, well, modern homes and modern habits have largely forgotten. They didn't fight the cold with more heat. They controlled movement. They reduced airflow after dusk, locked warmth into smaller living zones, and let the house go still. This wasn't folklore or superstition. It was applied physics learned through winters without central heating, without cheap fuel, and without the option to simply turn a dial higher. In older homes, evening marked a transition point. Windows that were cracked during the day were sealed. Internal doors that stayed open for light and movement were closed. Curtains were drawn not for privacy, but for insulation. Once the sun dropped and outdoor temperatures followed, the house was closed like a ship preparing for night seas. This wasn't about paranoia. It was about stopping convection currents. Moving air steals heat faster than cold air sitting still. By stopping airflow between rooms and between indoors and outdoors, families prevented warm air from migrating toward colder zones where it would be lost. This is why grandparents insisted doors stay shut once the cold sets in. They weren't being controlling. They were preserving thermal stability. A hallway, stairwell, or unused room was allowed to cool, acting as a buffer rather than a drain. Rooms were treated as thermal compartments, not open living spaces. Open-plan living would have been considered reckless in a coal-heated or wood-heated house. Heat sources were localized. A single fire, stove, or heater warmed one primary room. That room was sealed off and occupied. Bedrooms, pantries, and corridors were allowed to drop in temperature overnight because heating them would dilute the available warmth. Grandparents understood that heat spreads thin when given too much volume. This principle is directly applicable today. In winter, closing off unused rooms at night reduces the load on any heating system, whether electric, gas, or wood. Even in modern homes, warm air rises and escapes into stairwells and hallways if doors are left open. By closing doors before nightfall, you trap heat where people actually are, not where it quietly leaks away. Heavy curtains, well, they weren't just about looks. They served as real thermal barriers. You see, glass loses heat real fast after sunset, and our grandparents, they'd compensate by adding layers. Curtains would get drawn early, sometimes even before it was fully dark, especially on those north-facing windows. In some homes, folks would add secondary curtains or fabric liners just for winter. And, the same thinking went for doorways. Hanging a thick curtain over an interior door could cut down on drafts in a big way. That's because, fabric disrupts airflow. Cold air doesn't much like running into resistance. It slows down, pools up, and just loses momentum. Even nowadays, putting a heavy curtain over a rarely used exterior door or a drafty hallway can honestly make a real difference overnight. Grandparents understood that cold has a way of creeping along the ground before it touches anything else. That's why bare floors got covered in winter, often with extra rugs stacked right on top of each other. Beds, too, were raised a little bit off the floor. Folks avoided sitting directly on cold ground whenever they could. This wasn't about comfort culture, not really. It was just plain thermal awareness. And applying this today is pretty straightforward. Area rugs over tile or concrete floors, they cut down on heat loss through conduction. At night, especially in older houses or basements, this can honestly be the difference between a room holding onto its warmth or just bleeding it away by morning. Modern advice often pushes for constant ventilation, but older generations were a bit more selective about it. Fresh air was welcome during daylight hours when the sun added a bit of heat and moisture levels could be balanced. But at night, especially when it was damp or freezing, airflow was really reduced. Windows stayed shut, fire dampers were adjusted, and even movement within the house slowed down. This all matters because moving air, it accelerates heat loss through convection. A quiet house just stays warmer than an active one. That's why our grandparents discouraged pacing those hallways at night or leaving doors swinging open. Stillness, it preserved warmth. Bedrooms weren't heated all the time, not continuously. Instead, folks concentrated warmth right at the bed level. Extra blankets, wool layers, and sometimes bed curtains. Those all helped create a little microclimate. The room itself could be cold, but the sleeper stayed warm. This approach saved fuel and cut down on overnight heat loss from the main living space. For modern survivalists, that's a lesson worth remembering. In a power outage or a fuel shortage, heating your body is just more efficient than heating the whole room. Insulating your sleep system matters a whole lot more than the room temperature once you settle in for the night. The rule here is simple. Stop heat from moving once the sun goes down. Close doors, close curtains, reduce airflow, accept cooler, unused spaces, and concentrate warmth where it's really needed. This isn't about discomfort, it's about efficiency and resilience. In a grid-down scenario, this approach stretches out that limited fuel. In high-cost energy environments, it'll lower your bills without sacrificing safety. In older homes, it makes up for poor insulation without needing renovations. Even in modern houses, it just reinforces the physics that heating systems still have to follow. Grandparents didn't talk about thermal envelopes or convection loss, they just lived it. Their homes stayed warmer overnight not because they burned more fuel, but because they stopped warmth from wandering off into the dark. Cold doesn't need an invitation, it only needs a pathway. The quiet rule closed those pathways every single night. That rule still works, and honestly, it always will. Heat that doesn't move is heat that stays. If this kind of grounded, historically proven knowledge matters to you, go ahead and subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles. Share this with others who value real-world preparedness, and keep these lessons alive while they still matter.